Part 2, Time, Narrative, and the Margins of the Modern Nation. Anderson's canonical text has provoked an immense amount of academic commentary in the past several decades. Let us now turn to consider some of the most influential comments and critiques coming from post-colonial quarters, beginning with a very dense but highly suggestive essay from 1990 by Homi Bhabha, titled Dissemination, Time, Narrative, and the Margins of the Modern Nation. In the essay, Bhabha challenges Anderson's thesis about the hegemony of homogeneous empty time and its relation to the narration of the nation. According to Bhabha, the nation is constituted by a double time. In his words, there is always the distracting presence of another temporality that disturbs the contemporaneity of the national present. In turn, he insists, such an apprehension of the double and split time of national representation should lead us to question the homogeneous and horizontal view familiarly associated with it. Bhabha's focus is on the margins of the nation, with colonials, post-colonials, migrants, minorities, wandering peoples who will not be contained within the Heim of the national culture and its unisonant discourse, but are themselves the marks of a shifting boundary that alienates the frontiers of the modern nation. Bhabha is concerned to illuminate how, in the production of the nation as narration, there is a split between the continuous, accumulative temporality of what he calls the pedagogical and the repetitious, recursive strategy of what he calls the performative. To this end, he seeks to center counter-narratives of the nation that continually evoke and erase its totalizing boundaries, both actual and conceptual, and disturb those ideological maneuvers through which imagined communities are given essentialist identities. He thus takes up the task of exploring forms of cultural identity and political solidarity that emerge from the disjunctive temporalities of the national culture. This is, he contends, a lesson of history to be learned from those people whose histories of marginality have been most profoundly enmeshed in the antinomies of law and order, the colonized and women. Bhabha takes from Frantz Fanon the point that the knowledge of the people depends on the discovery of a much more fundamental substance, which itself is continually being renewed, a structure of repetition that is not visible in the translucidity of the people's customs or the obvious objectivities which seem to characterize the people. He continues, it is from this instability of cultural signification that the national cultural comes to be articulated as a dialectic of various temporalities, modern, colonial, post-colonial, native, that cannot be a knowledge that is stabilized in its enunciation. Again, quoting Fanon, it is always contemporaneous with the act of recitation. It is the present act that on each of its occurrences marshals in the ephemeral temporality inhabiting the space between the I have heard and you will hear. From the margins, the subaltern intervenes to interrupt the temporal presuppositions of synchronicity, interjecting different temporalities into the sinews of the nation, in the process disturbing its essentializing and totalizing tendencies. Such a focus at the margins, Bhabha insists, makes it imperative to question those Western theories of the horizontal, homogeneous empty time of the nation's narrative. Likewise, from Julia Kristeva, Bhabha takes again the idea that the borders of the nation are constantly faced with a double temporality, the process of identity constituted by historical sedimentation, the pedagogical, and the loss of identity in the signifying process of cultural identification, the performative. And again, he emphasizes the coexistence and combination of multiple temporalities. In his words, the concurrent circulation of linear, cursive, and monumental time in the same cultural space constitutes a new historic temporality that Kristeva identifies with psychoanalytically informed feminist strategies of political identification. Fanon's occult instability and Kristeva's parallel times both disturb the hegemony of homogeneous empty time upon which Anderson insists the nation is founded. Bhabha accuses Anderson of misunderstanding the significance of the meanwhile, of wrongly embedding it within homogeneous empty time. According to Bhabha, the meanwhile is the barred sign of the processual and performative, not a simple present continuous, but the present as succession without synchrony. In embedding the meanwhile of the national narrative, where the people live their plural and autonomous lives within homogeneous empty time, Anderson misses the alienating and iterative time of the sign. He naturalizes the momentary suddenness of the arbitrary sign, its pulsation, by making it part of the historical emergence of the novel, a narrative of synchrony. But the suddenness of the signifier is incessant, instantaneous rather than simultaneous. It introduces a signifying space of repetition rather than a progressive or linear seriality. The meanwhile turns into quite another time or ambivalent sign of the national people. It is the time of the people's anonymity. If it is the time of the people's anonymity, it is also the space of the nation's anomie. As if that weren't dense enough, Bhabha proceeds to accuse Anderson of misappropriating Benjamin as well. In Bhabha's articulation, Anderson fails to locate the alienating time of the arbitrary sign in his naturalized, nationalized space of the imagined community. Although he borrows his notion of homogeneous empty time of the nation's modern narrative from Walter Benjamin, he fails to read that profound ambivalence that Benjamin places deep within the utterance of the narrative of modernity. Benjamin introduces a non-synchronous, incommensurable gap in the midst of storytelling. From this split in the utterance, from the unbeguiled, belated novelist, there emerges an ambivalence in the narration of modern society that repeats, uncounseled and unconsolable in the midst of plenitude. The full thrust of Bhabha's postcolonial, postmodern discourse is certainly difficult to follow. What is clear, however, is that he is seeking to champion the view from the margins of the nation, which he argues should lead us to complexify Anderson's narrative about synchronicity and homogeneous empty time. Bhabha would seem suspicious of Anderson's endorsement of the nation, his alleged reification of its horizontally imagined community. He champions, instead of national unity, the ideal of hybridity as embodied in the way of life of marooned communities of runaway slaves and fugitives existing at the margins of the nation and expressed in the rhetorical strategies of the Black national text of the Harlem Renaissance. Likewise, he invokes a film about the Black diaspora in Britain, Handsworth's Songs, shot in the midst of the 1985 Birmingham riots, haunted by memories flashing up in a moment of danger. He remarks, "There are no stories in the riots, only the ghosts of other stories." In sum, for Bhabha, the temporality erupting and interrupting from the margins of the nation would seem something altogether different from homogeneous and empty. Nation and imagination. Dipesh Chakrabarty, in a chapter titled Nation and Imagination in his critically acclaimed 2000 book, Provincializing Europe, also takes aim at Anderson's account of the nation, with a focus on issues of translatability in the Indian context of the key concept of imagination. In a word, Chakrabarty seeks to provincialize Anderson's notion of imagination. He does so by reading a global history of the word imagination. He begins by acknowledging that Anderson's book has made us all aware of how crucial the category imagination is to the analysis of nationalism. Yet he contends, compared to the idea of community, imagination remains a curiously undiscussed category in social science writings of nationalism. Though Anderson warns that the word should not be taken to mean false, beyond that, Chakrabarty notes, its meaning is taken to be self-evident. As such, Chakrabarty takes up the task of opening the word for further interrogation and therefore rendering visible the heterogeneous practices of seeing we often bring under the jurisdiction of this one European word, imagination. At the same time, Chakrabarty suggests that collapsing different phenomena under the single rubric of imagination entails a certain homogenization of the political field. By contrast, to breathe heterogeneity into the word imagination is to allow for the possibility that the field of the political is constitutively not singular. To make his case, Chakrabarty engages with the writings of the Bengali 1913 Nobel laureate Rabindranath Tagore. In particular, he explores how Tagore navigated the following problematic. If the nation, the people, or the country were not just to be observed, described, and critiqued, but loved as well, what would guarantee that they were indeed worth loving unless one also saw in them something that was already lovable? The danger was that an objectivist realist view might lead only to disidentification. Indeed, a view that was merely realist might not present an India that was lovable. To be able to love India was to go beyond realism, to pierce the veil of the real, as Tagore put it. In Tagore's writings, Chakrabarty contends, the prosaic and the poetic came to share a division of labor. On the one hand, The prosaic element spoke of poverty, ill health, factionalism, ignorance, casteism, feudal oppression, and so on. And on the other, the poetic pictured the Bengali home village as a place blessed with divine grace and beauty, a peaceful home for the tender Bengali heart, the golden Bengal of nationalist sentiments. And crucially for Tagore, claims Chakrabarty, the poetic took us outside of historical time. As such, together prose and poetry posed and answered the question of the two ways of seeing in Bengali nationalism. Moreover, when a younger generation came to accuse Tagore that his conception of the poetic lacked ways of handling the miserable realities of everyday life in Calcutta and Bengal, Tagore responded by inventing a new prose form called Gadya Kabita, or prose poetry. For Tagore, the function of the poetic was to create a caesura in historical time and transport us to a realm that transcended the historical. In this vein, Chakrabarty insists that, according to Tagore, the realm of the poetic laced the everyday, but had to be revealed by the operation of the poetic eye. Recourse to the poetic was, in an important sense, a compensatory move. Tagore used the materiality of language, its sounds, rhythms, and melodies, to reconstitute, not deny, a reality that contained material and other forms of deprivation. From here, Chakrabarty proceeds to pose a difficult question. Was piercing the veil of the real, the phrase Tagore used to describe the mode of viewing in which India appeared as already lovable, was this mode of viewing the same as what is conceived by imagining in Benedict Anderson's book on nationalism? Chakrabarty suggests that ultimately it was not. He points out there is a family of terms in North Indian languages for this activity of seeing beyond the real, of being in the presence of the deity. One of them is darshan, to see. In so doing, Chakrabarty does not intend to reduce Tagore's point about seeing beyond the real to practices that preceded British rule in India and thus present Indian nationalism as a site of an unbridgeable difference between the West and the East. To the contrary, he admits Tagore and nationalism in general obviously derive much from European Romanticism. To this end, he notes Tagore's idea of the transcendental was unmistakably idealist. Nevertheless, Chakrabarty goes on to insist, my point is that the moment of vision that affected a cessation of the historical world included plural and heterogeneous ways of seeing that raised some questions about the analytical reach of the European category, imagination. Chakrabarty lauds Anderson for having made an enormously suggestive use of the word imagination to describe roles the novel, the newspaper, the map, the museum, and the census play in creating the empty, homogeneous time of history that allows the different parts of a nation to exist all at once in some nationalist imaginary of simultaneity. And yet, Chakrabarty returns to the point that Anderson takes the meaning of imagination to be self-evident, even as he cautions that it should not be read to mean false. Yet, Chakrabarty insists, imagination is a word with a long and complex history in European thought. In addition, he adds, its status as a criterion for judging literary merit has been questioned in discussions of Sanskrit aesthetics. Chakrabarty then turns to provide a brief sketch of the history of the word. According to him, the word comes out of the 17th century theories of psychology and makes its way through many debates and through Hume, Kant, Schelling, and others into Coleridge's theory of primary and secondary imagination in Biographia Literaria. In its use in European Romanticism, Chakrabarty insists, the word has deep connections to Christian conceptions of the divine, and even its later secular form cannot quite overcome an older distinction between the mind and the senses. From here, Chakrabarty goes on to submit that imagination remains a mentalist, subject-centered category in Anderson's thought-provoking account of nationalism. By contrast, he emphasizes darshan, or divyadrishti, divine sight, names which Chakrabarty uses for a family of viewing practices, as they occur in modern Bengali nationalist writings, are not necessarily subject-centered mentalist categories. Indeed, he continues, to follow the more contemporary Deleuzian instincts of analysis, one could say that the moment of practice is a moment that bypasses and not just dissolves the subject-object distinction. Chakrabarty emphasizes the ambivalence, the undecidability of imagination in its mentalist sense and divine sight, divyadrishti, as something belonging to the history of practice. According to Chakrabarty, there is no doubt that the Tagorean move of transcending the historical in order to be able to see an India already worthy of adoration owes a debt to European Romanticism and to its mentalist categories. To this end, he adds, Tagore's reference to Keats and his critique of utility, as well as his spiritual material distinctions, mixed Vedantic thought with European Romanticism. Nevertheless, Chakrabarty contends, if the moment of seeing beyond includes phenomena such as darshan or divyadrishti that do not necessarily require the assumption of a subject, then there are interesting implications for how the category imagination may be addressed in post-colonial histories. Chakrabarty thus draws the conclusion that together these modes of perception suggest that imagination can be both a subject-centered and a subjectless practice. He furthermore suggests that this inherent plurality of the category imagination is also what in the end makes it impossible to see the political as something that constitutes a one or a whole. Chakrabarty ends the article by returning to the functions of prose versus poetry for Tagore. He remarks, one was charged with the responsibility to locate the political and historical time. The other created a political that resisted historicization. And he goes on to surmise that this constitutional heterogeneity of the political mirrors the irreducible pluralities that contend in the history of the word imagination. A subtle but nevertheless profound critique of the universalizability of the framework of imagined communities through which Anderson conceptualizes the nation form. Whose imagined community? Partha Chatterjee, too, questions the universalizing applicability of Anderson's conceptualization of the nation form. In the opening chapter, Whose Imagined Community, to his 1993 book, The Nation and Its Fragments, Colonial and Post-Colonial Histories, Chatterjee accuses Anderson's attempt to treat the phenomenon of nationalism as part of the universal history of the modern world of ending up effectively denying the agency of colonized peoples. Like Chakrabarty, Chatterjee begins by recognizing many virtues in Anderson's account. According to Chatterjee, Anderson demonstrates with much subtlety and originality that nations were not the determinate products of given sociological conditions such as language or race or religion. They had been in Europe and everywhere else in the world imagined into existence. Chatterjee also commends Anderson for describing some of the major institutional forms through which this imagined community came to acquire concrete shape, especially the institutions of what he so ingeniously called print capitalism. Where Chatterjee finds fault with Anderson is with the next step in his argument. As Chatterjee summarizes that next step, Anderson then argued that the historical experience of nationalism in Western Europe, in the Americas, and in Russia had supplied for all subsequent nationalisms a set of modular forms from which nationalist elites in Asia and Africa had chosen the ones they liked. This leads Chatterjee to present his one central objection to Anderson's argument. In Chatterjee's provocative formulation, if nationalisms in the rest of the world have to choose their imagined community from certain modular forms already made available to them by Europe and the Americas, what do they have left to imagine? History, it would seem, has decreed that we in the post-colonial world shall only be perpetual consumers of modernity. Europe and the Americas, the only true subjects of history, have thought out on our behalf not only the script of colonial enlightenment and exploitation, but also that of our anti-colonial resistance and post-colonial misery. Even our imaginations must remain forever colonized. Chatterjee continues by clarifying that he does not object to this argument for any sentimental reason. Rather, he insists he objects because he cannot reconcile it with the evidence on anti-colonial nationalism. According to Chatterjee, the most powerful as well as the most creative results of the nationalist imagination in Asia and Africa are posited not on an identity, but rather on a difference with the modular forms of the national society propagated by the modern West. Since this is so, he asks, how can we ignore this without reducing the experience of anti-colonial nationalism to a caricature of itself? Part of the problem, Chatterjee contends, has to do with the rather exclusive focus of histories of nationalism on the contest for the state. Such an exclusive focus, Chatterjee insists, misses some of the central dynamics of anti-colonial nationalism, which precede and in part escape the logic of the explicitly political contest. As Chatterjee sees it, anti-colonial nationalism creates its own domain of sovereignty within colonial society well before it begins its political battle with the imperial power. It does this by dividing the world of social institutions and practices into two domains, the material and spiritual. On the one hand, Chatterjee argues, the material is the domain of the outside, of the economy and of statecraft, of science and technology, a domain where the West had proved its superiority and the East had succumbed. In this domain, then, Western superiority had to be acknowledged and its accomplishments carefully studied and replicated. On the other hand, Chatterjee continues, the spiritual is an inner domain bearing the essential marks of cultural identity. From this, Chatterjee concludes, the greater one's success in imitating Western skills in the material domain, therefore, the greater the need to preserve the distinctiveness of one's spiritual culture. This formula, Chatterjee posits, is a fundamental feature of anti-colonial nationalisms in Asia and Africa. Here is where the creativity, the agency in anti-colonial nationalist dynamics is located, according to Chatterjee. In his words, here nationalism launches its most powerful, creative, and historically significant project to fashion a modern national culture that is nevertheless not Western. From this point, he goes on to contend, if the nation is an imagined community, then this is where it is brought into being. And crucially, he contends, in this, its true and essential domain, the nation is already sovereign, even when the state is in the hands of the colonial power. He therefore concludes, the dynamics of this historical project is completely missed in conventional histories in which the story of nationalism begins with the conquest, the contest for political power. Even where Chatterjee proves quite sympathetic to Anderson's account, for example, in the emphasis on the processes of print capitalism, he nevertheless makes a point of stressing that Anderson is wrong to imply that European patterns of development were somehow simply transposed elsewhere. As Chatterjee formulates the argument, Anderson is certainly correct in his suggestion that it is print capitalism which provides the new institutional space for the development of the modern national language. Even so, he goes on to add, however, the specificities of the colonial situation do not allow a simple transposition of European patterns of development. To make the case, he brings up Bengal. In his words, in Bengal, for instance, it is at the initiative of the East India Company and the European missionaries that the first printed books are produced in Bengali at the end of the 18th century and the first narrative prose compositions composed at the beginning of the 19th. Chatterjee ends his argument by insisting on the distinction between community and state. He contends that autonomous forms of imagination of the community were and continue to be overwhelmed and swamped by the history of the post-colonial state. In this vein, he emphasizes, here lies the root of our post-colonial misery, not in our inability to think out new forms of the modern community, but in our surrender to the old forms of the modern state. By extension, Chatterjee suggests that the theoretical framework provided by Anderson is guilty of conflating the nation form with the state as well. He argues, if the nation is an imagined community, and if nations must also take the form of states, then our theoretical language must allow us to talk about community and state at the same time. I do not think our present theoretical language allows us to do this. To carve out such a theoretical space is central to Chatterjee's effort in the book. Or, as he puts it, again provocatively, the project is to claim for us, the once colonized, our freedom of imagination. And with that, we will take another break.